The movie starts with a group of gangsters setting ablaze a man despite his pleas for help. Then the scene shifts to the gang leader, Bumpy, distributing food aids to a crowd of poor masses with his right-hand man, Frank, in the crowd staring deathly at him. Bumpy notices and calls out to him for a private chat. As they stroll along the street, Bumpy begins to complain about the drastic economic changes occurring in the country.
It's gotten so big, you just can't find your way.
And as they walk into a store, Bumpy experiences a heart attack, and despite Frank's call for help from the store owner, no one responds.
Call the ambulance!
Bumpy eventually dies, and his funeral is attended by tons of gang leaders and prominent figures. The news reports on his death, describing him as a hero to locals but a criminal to the government.
Bumpy Johnson, age 62 when he passed, was a folk hero among Harlem locals for over 4 decades.
Meanwhile, in the funeral room, the attendees are lost in their own world and use the funeral as a socialization session. One of the guests, Tango, even treats Frank as a waiter, sending him on an errand for lighter.
Go get me a light while you're at it.
However, Frank ignores the disrespect. Suddenly, a man walks up to him to express his condolences. He also promises to show support whenever Frank decides to go after everyone in the room who was indebted to his dead boss.
I'm sure Bumpy didn't say anything to you, but he made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, then I should make sure that you want for nothing.
Then the scene shifts to Richie, a cop aspiring to become a lawyer. While investigating a drug case with his colleague, Jay, he mistakenly finds a truck with $1 million in cash. Initially, Jay insists that they keep the money for themselves, but Richie ends up turning over the money to the higher-ups, which earns him weird looks from his colleagues in the station. Unknown to him, Detective Trupo, one of the higher-ups in the police department, has deep connections with several drug lords. Frank learns about this from an Italian drug lord, and after an encounter with Tango, who refuses to cooperate since the gang leader is dead,
Bumpy's fucking dead.
Frank goes into deep thoughts and decides to get into the drug business. First off, he contacts his cousin Nate in Thailand for partnership. Then, he withdraws $400,000 from the bank before traveling to Thailand to meet his cousin. Meanwhile, Richie's wife announces leaving the state with their son and also expresses her desire to get a divorce from him.
We don't have room for us. I'll see you in court.
And at the same time, Richie struggles to prepare for his law exams.
You have 10 minutes remaining.
In Bangkok, Thailand, Frank meets up with Nate, who works in the army, to negotiate with a group of local drug dealers. When he requests for a large amount of drugs, Nate advises him to find multiple sources.
Nobody I know can get you that much personally, all right? You're gonna have to piece it together from several sources.
However, Frank insists on getting it directly from the main source, which prompts them to go into the jungle to meet the main drug producer. The producer doesn't believe in Frank's ability to smuggle 100 kilos of heroin into the US, but seeing Frank's strong resolve, he agrees to the partnership. So, production of the drug begins, and Frank puts Nate in charge of its transportation to the US. Meanwhile, Richie gets himself in a situation when his partner Jay gets involved in drugs and kills a local dealer. Although Richie prevents Jay from getting lynched by a mob, he, however, insists on keeping his morals by deciding not to cover up for Jay. At the same time, Frank successfully picks up his drugs from the airport, and a scientist confirms it is 100% pure.
I mean, there's no adulterants, no alcohol, there's no dilutants. It's 100%.
So, Frank begins distribution of the drug to every area in New York while also keeping a low profile. However, the death rate from drug abuse begins to rise.
America's public enemy #1 in the United States is drug abuse.
So the government sets up a special narcotics bureau and secretly recruits Richie to head investigations in the area. Meanwhile, Frank buys a huge property for his mother and reunites with his entire family. Then, he introduces his brothers to the drug business and also takes revenge on Tango by killing him in public. At the same time, Richie assembles a small group of detectives to investigate blue magic, the drug sold by Frank. One day, Frank attends a party and falls in love at first sight with a Puerto Rico beauty queen. However, he's distracted by his brother's lavish dressing, so he privately berates him for dressing in expensive suits that could make the cops suspicious of their source of income.
The loudest one in the room
is the weakest one in the room. I told you that.
Later in the night, Frank meets and introduces himself to Eva, the beauty queen. On the other hand, Richie passes his bar exams while working with his team to discover new leads on blue magic. Frank also introduces Eva to his mother, thereby bringing their relationship to the next level.
Is this her?
Ava, this is my mother.
Eva.
Oh,
Nice to meet you.
she's beautiful.
After a few months, Frank expands his business and opens up distribution units in North Carolina, Queens, New Jersey, Brooklyn, and several other states, earning him millions. With this newfound wealth, a rich businessman initiates a deal, leading Frank to gain monopoly of the drug business. One day, Frank proposes to Ava, so she gifts him an expensive coat.
Do you like it?
The coat, yeah, it's nice.
To celebrate their engagement, they attend a boxing match packed with celebrities, politicians, and high-ranking individuals. Coincidentally, Richie is also present at this event and notices the special attention given to Frank, so he grows suspicious of Frank's identity and immediately launches an investigation. However, his team has no information on Frank, leading to a dead end. Frank eventually marries Eva.
I wish Bumpy had met him.
But on the wedding day, their car is blocked by Captain Trupo, leader of the Special Investigative Unit, who insists on some sort of due payments after he had noticed that Frank's coat to the boxing match costs $50,000. Upon hearing this, Frank immediately rushes home and burns the coat in an attempt to maintain his low profile. But it's too late. Richie now has intel on Frank, so his team begins to investigate all of Frank's brothers. This leads them to discover Frank's drug distribution and collection centers. One day, while returning from a business meeting with a dealer, Frank and his brother get blocked again by Captain Trupo, who discovers a bag of drugs in his car. Frank becomes angry and beats up his brother for being careless. Unknown to them, Richie witnesses this scene from afar while tailing them. As Richie decides to investigate deeper into Frank's case, his best friend advises against it and reveals that Frank has a network of support from politicians.
You don't have a choice. Just leave Frank Lucas alone.
But this only motivates Richie to put all of his attention on Frank. One day, Frank narrowly escapes an assassination attempt on him and his wife, leading his brothers to suspect their competitor, Nikki, is behind the attack. However, Frank dismisses their suspicions and also kicks against his wife's idea of relocating to another country.
Frank Lucas don't run from nobody, baby. And we ain't going nowhere. We're gonna stay right here. We're gonna stay right here. This is my home.
While this is happening, the news reports that the U.S. are withdrawing troops from Vietnam and Thailand, making Frank worried about his production source. So he immediately contacts Nate to request over 2,000 kilos of drugs.
I want 2,000 keys in the air.
It's impossible, Frank.
When Nate disagrees with this, Frank quickly makes a last-minute trip to Thailand. Meanwhile, Richie witnesses one of Frank's cousins shooting a girl, so they threaten to put him in jail for attempted murder. To save himself from jail, Jimmy agrees to plant a listening device on himself in order to get intel that could implicate Frank. At the same time, Frank meets with the drug producer in Thailand to think of another way to smuggle the drugs. Previously, the drugs were secretly smuggled through military planes, but since this channel will be cut off, Frank has to think of other ways. While in Thailand, he contacts his brother to inform him about a drug shipment. Unknown to them, Richie and his team are eavesdropping on this conversation through the listening device on Jimmy. From the conversation, they're able to decode and discover that a drug shipment will be arriving through a military plane. So on the day of the plane's arrival, Richie presents a warrant to search the plane.
Richie Roberts, Essex County. I know you're expecting us.
They search every corner of the plane but end up finding nothing. At the last moment, Richie decides to open up the coffin of American soldiers being transported back. Upon opening the coffin, he only finds the dead body of a soldier. However, he's interrupted by an officer who severely criticizes him for suggesting that the military could be involved in drug smuggling. When Richie explains that his source of intel is legit, the officer flares up in anger, unable to believe that a black man like Frank can secretly smuggle drugs through a military plane. At the same time, Captain Trupo and his unit visit Frank's home to ransack it for money. After harassing Frank's wife and mother, they eventually discover several bags of money hidden in the dog's house. Meanwhile, Richie continues to tail the transportation of the coffins, and at the same time, Frank returns to the country from Thailand. and learns that the Special Investigation Unit had ransacked his house.
Fucking Trupo came by the house, man.
While keeping close watch on the coffins, Richie and his team discovers that the drugs were hidden in a secret compartment of the coffin. So they decide to tail the truck transporting the drugs out. Once they discover the storage center, Richie immediately requests a warrant and for backup to surround the area. As soon as the backup arrives, they raid the area, leading to an open fire between the cops and Frank's men. One of Frank's brothers tries to escape from the raid, but Richie catches him after a chase. Afterwards, the cops go to arrest Frank while he's in the middle of a church service. All of his distribution units are ransacked, and he's eventually charged in court for drug smuggling.
That Frank Lucas is the most dangerous man walking the streets of our city.
One day after a court session, Frank seeks a private time with Richie and tries to convince him to drop the court case. However, Richie insists on pursuing the case to the end. Seeing this, Frank decides to strike a deal where he agrees to reveal names of cops and other high-ranking officers involved in the smuggling. In response to this, Richie promises to make his life in jail easier until the day of his release. So, Frank exposes the information of everyone, leading to the arrest of half of the officers assigned to the Drug Enforcement Agency. Frank also assists in the investigation process and directs the cops' attention to Captain Trupo, who stole the money from his doghouse. Seeing that his arrest is imminent, Captain Trupo takes his life to avoid arrest. As soon as everyone is arrested, Richie applauds Frank for his assistance. Eventually, the court sentences Frank to 70 years in prison for the distribution of narcotics. Over $250 million worth of his assets were confiscated. About 3/4 of drug enforcement officers were also convicted for collaborating AOA, and over 30 members of Frank's family were sent to prison. Frank's wife returns to Puerto Rico, while Richie quit his job as a cop to become Frank's defense attorney. Due to Frank's help in convicting other criminals, the court reduced his sentence to 15 years, and he was eventually released in 1991. Upon his release from prison, Richie waits outside to celebrate his release. As they take a stroll down the city, Frank is fascinated by how many changes had occurred while he was in prison.